This work of fiction has been created by a massive amount of wonderful developers within a toxic environment perpetuated by a number of people, like the game's creative director, known across different studios as a person who was very difficult to work with and talked a big game while doing little, though still taking credit for pretty much all the decisions made, or the lead game designer, described by many as edgelord bully, who after this game would eventually gain editorial power despite the massive amount of complaints against him. Celebrate developers and positive work culture, don't idolize toxic leadership, rather call them out on it and demand to be better. Assassin's Creed 2 is the game that has made the Assassin's Creed franchise actually popular and mainstream. The first game, my review of which you should check before watching this one as we will have a lot of references and comparisons, link is in the description and YouTube cards, was a commercial success but gained limited popularity among players and critics. The 2009 sequel, on the other hand, became beloved by many and was touted as being an improvement over the first game in every way, even going as far as saying that it is what the first Assassin's Creed should have been. I can't say I agree, because it's one of those cases where a sequel takes the engine and mechanics of the previous game, but instead of advancing its principles further and polishing them up, the successor does something entirely different with the same engine and mechanics. Assassin's Creed as a franchise is often criticized for changing direction to go with what's popular or expected. Assassin's Creed 2 is where this process began. Assassin's Creed 1 had its share of flaws, but its focus was on creating a specific assassin fantasy. Yet there existed an overwhelming expectation of a medieval GTA, which wasn't met until Assassin's Creed 2. Medieval GTA is exactly what the game has given to players, a constant supply of varying activities where you essentially play as a superhero. Your character Ezio even has a cape now. That's accidental, though it does help with the analogy. But let's not beat around the bush and delve deep into what makes the game actually tick. The version chosen for this video is the remaster from the Ezio collection, which I consider to be the definitive way to play the game. I know the arguments against it, and I agree with them. Some faces look like they have been burned down on the sun, some new textures are too detailed for the models they're put on, and lighting in some interior locations is quite frankly messed up. But you know, even the original Assassin's Creed 2 wasn't exactly a looker when it came to characters and a number of specific details. Plus it had a bunch of technical flaws in the environments to boot, which the console remaster fixes. Also, and this is really the big one for me, the remaster removes the city color filters. I am theoretically not against those, but in the case of Assassin's Creed 2, a lot of color is washed out because of them. And if in a city like Forli that makes sense and even gives a special sort of mood which is not as prominent in the remaster but overall still there, Venice with its filters really doesn't look great. A lot of color just becomes different shades of blue. Plus, the Ezio Collection version is the most content-complete one, including even an obscure bonus skin previously given as a reward for connecting to a particular phone operator, so there's that too. Though I consider the remastered version changes to be a net positive overall, at the end of the day it's just a matter of preference. In terms of gameplay, all versions are identical, so there's no way to go wrong in that regard. My name is Stanislav Costiuc, I am a game designer, and this is my review of Assassin's Creed 2. As always, we'll utilize the help of my Stasocritic system, the first category of which is design. This is the most important part of Stasocritic with the biggest weight. 4. As the way a game is played, built and structured is what really defines our experience when engaging with it. Assassin's Creed 2 is a very good study case of core pillars for several reasons. First, it shows that having the same pillars as the original game doesn't mean that you provide the same experience, because pillars are a broad notion and there's many ways you can utilize them. Assassin's Creed 2 has almost the same pillars as the first game: stealth, combat and parkour. I say almost because the sequel focuses on the aspect of traditional stealth much more than Assassin's Creed 1, with social stealth being only a part of that and not the entire pillar. Despite the fundamental similarities though, how all these pillars are implemented in the world, design and missions is quite different. Let's start with social stealth. In Assassin's Creed, social stealth was a behavioral mechanic. Guards were far less likely to notice you if you behave like one of NPCs in the world, and everything depended on whether you're doing high or low profile actions, with high profile actions causing detection faster, especially in cases when the guards are alert. Assassin's Creed 2 changes the principles of social stealth entirely. It transforms all crowds into hiding spots like the monks were in Assassin's Creed 1. But if in Assassin's Creed 1 the monks were about infiltration or escaping, in the sequel the blend groups are the social stealth aspect. On one hand, it does give more importance to NPCs in the world by transforming them into active gameplay elements. On the other hand, everybody essentially becomes bushes for you to hide in, some of them movable. So Assassin's Creed 2 actually doubles down on the biggest flaw of Assassin's Creed 1, the fact that social stealth revolves around being detected or undetected without any ways to manipulate the environment. Only now it doesn't even matter that much how you act as long as you're in a blend group and you can run like crazy from one to another and it's going to be fine. The new notoriety system only solidifies this aspect of stealth being based on line of sight rather than behavior. In the first Assassin's Creed, enemies would become more aware of you as the story progresses, so free running past them would become a dangerous act, you would have to walk instead, behavioral approach. In Assassin's Creed 2, different actions like air assassinations, prolonged fights, or stealing money will gradually raise your notoriety bar, and once it's full, you become notorious. Now, let's ignore the fact that it's incredibly easy, if monotonous, to fully remove notoriety by doing some simple actions. When you're in this state, the guard's suspicion bar starts to fill up regardless of what you're doing, and this is an approach focusing on line of sight more so than your behavior. Sure, free running will make the suspicion bar fill up faster, but at the end of the day, if you free run between crowds, you're fine. So it's still less about how you act and more about whether you're hidden in a crowd or not. To be fair, Assassin's Creed 2 does add a mechanic that is about actual crowd manipulation. Throwing money, which brings all people into one place to pick them up and makes guards not pay attention to you, providing an opportunity to pass by. But the game also makes this addition mostly useless through inclusion of hired groups: courtesans, thieves, and mercenaries. Each group theoretically represents one of the game's core pillars, though ultimately their purpose is the same: to distract guards. And in a much more permanent way than throwing money does too, the effect of which can run out when you really need it to be active.
Wow! What luck! There he is!
Courtesans are also movable hiding spots which you control, making them much more useful than crowds. They do have an added disadvantage of automatically distracting guards that get too close, thus leaving your little crowd, but it's still much better to use them than the random NPCs surrounding you. In Assassin's Creed 1, crowds were in the game mostly for atmosphere. Mechanically, you didn't need most of the random NPCs around you, it was all about your actions. Assassin's Creed 2 makes crowds vital for stealth by transforming them into hiding groups which are required to avoid detection and giving a tool to manipulate them so guards could be distracted, and then makes that change useless by adding better ways of doing both things that don't require a crowd at all. And the funny part is that some of the best missions in Assassin's Creed 2 revolve around hired groups purposefully not being put in the area. Like the mission where you need to infiltrate a church to kill a target by blending with the monks, while having to be mindful to not get into a group of guards that are disguised as monks themselves, and you can differentiate them either by noticing their weapons or looking through eagle vision. That is a very memorable experience, and the big reason why is because it fully takes advantage of the way Assassin's Creed 2 has chosen to utilize its social stealth pillar. And honestly, I wish Assassin's Creed 2 would have done more with this style of design, as too many times the game's stealth missions actually don't involve any crowds at all and are all about traditional stealth rather than social one. And traditional stealth does not work in this game properly, with far too many issues to list, but we will try. First, guards that have at least a tiny bit of their suspicion bar filled up most of the time detect you for a split second while you are killing them. This happens when you assassinate them in low profile, when you air assassinate them, in which case they notice you while you're in the air, but the weirdest situation is probably when you throw a knife at them. As soon as you throw a knife, even if they're facing with their backs, they will turn around and start getting suspicious, leading to detection when they die. Now, what does a split second of detection matter if the guard is about to die anyway? Well, Assassin's Creed 2 features a considerable number of missions where you have to stay or kill undetected, and that split-second detection is enough to fail the condition. If a guard happens to turn around while you're doing an air assassination, congratulations, you have to restart. If you decide to throw a knife at them, congratulations, time to restart. Ironically, the absolute best stealth weapon in this game is the loudest one aesthetically, the hidden gun. Assassin's Creed 2 makes a big deal of how loud it is, with the dogs barking in the distance when you fire it. In truth, it's actually very silent, and you can kill a bunch of guards standing close by without getting detected. Incidentally, the hidden gun is the only weapon which doesn't lead to split-second detection behavior even if the guards have practically reached the hostile state, so it is really your best bet to deal with any target silently. Now, besides the issue of detection, there are also problems with line of sight. It is set up in a pretty weird way, with a horizontal distance that is too short and vertical distance that is too high. There is a mission in San Gimignano, a city full of towers. Your target is in the central, largest tower, but there are many towers in the vicinity with archers on them. The premise is that you first have to kill those archers to be able to climb the tower normally. Except you don't. Nobody will actually detect you if you just start climbing the tower you need. But people will detect you if you're like 2 stories above them within their horizontal range, which makes it very difficult to define what is the actual safe height from enemy or target detection. And here's the thing, I'm not sure if you're seen just based on the head or the whole body, but regardless, even if most of you is hidden but there is a little detectable part of you sticking out, you will be getting sighted. It might be just the tip of your hood when you're standing behind a wall on a rooftop, or a body part when you're hanging on a balcony several floors above your target, but they still will see you. And by the way, civilian targets, meaning those that aren't based on a guard archetype, will change their behavior to running away as soon as their yellow suspicious bar is filled up, most likely because they don't have the red investigation bar like guards do. The problem is, in restricted zones, everybody starts with a yellow suspicious bar fully filled up, meaning that if your civilian target is going to notice you for a split second somewhere in a tower, let's say, then they will start running away instantly. And related to that, there is a number of assassination contracts where locking on target initiates them noticing you and running away, even if you're actually hidden. But this is not everything that transforms stealthing in Assassin's Creed 2 into an exercise in frustration. The game makes the air assassination technique from the first game much simpler to perform, while also adding new techniques like killing guards from haystacks or benches. Air assassination does not turn off Ezio's collision while he's jumping towards the target he's about to kill. This means that if at any point any part of his body touches something after you already have started the animation, you will fail. In some cases, it works out in a funny manner. But most of the time, it doesn't.
Where is that one from? I know. Hey, that could be him.
One of the coolest new assassination opportunities happens from benches. Ezio stands up, stabs the target, and makes it sit on the bench like nothing happened. It's great, but it literally doesn't work. Even though it is a low-profile assassination, after you put down the target on the bench, the civilians beside you will stand up, revealing the dead body on the bench to all guards in the vicinity. Successful stealth in Assassin's Creed 2 really depends on you knowing all of these pitfalls so you will be able to avoid them. It's not great when a game essentially forces you to not use the number of tools it provides, especially considering that a lot of new things Assassin's Creed 2 adds for the purposes of variety have either very limited uses or their efficiency is cancelled out by another of the game's changes. For example, Assassin's Creed 2 adds a poison blade which makes enemies go mad for a while before dying, but outside of a couple specific situations, for example where you can try to poison a lot of people at the same time, it's not that different from a low-profile standard assassination, just the delay of death and guards noticing it is longer. And while that may seem like a worthy trade-off, in a lot of cases the guards become alert when the poison starts to act before the target dies or goes mad, which sort of transforms successful use of poison into a matter of luck for the player. Then there's smoke bombs, which help to lose sight from enemies. Now, the logic for their inclusion is sound. Assassin's Creed 2 doesn't have vigilantes like the first game did, so there were no tools that would help with breaking line of sight, enabling you to hide somewhere. Smoke bombs fill that role perfectly. But also in Assassin's Creed 2 they're largely pointless anyway, as the game drastically decreases the chase and search radius for enemies to the point that simply running is enough for you to escape the guard's sight without even parkouring. The only exception is if you are being chased by Agiles, which are an enemy archetype that has faster speed than you on flat ground, but not during parkour. And here we get to the first difference related to the combat pillar of Assassin's Creed: additions of specific archetypes. In the first game, all enemies had the same moves as you do, it's just lower-ranked soldiers knew less of them than higher-ranked ones, which had the exact same moveset as Altair. In Assassin's Creed 2, this is only partially true, as different enemy archetypes have different properties and behavior. For example, in combat, Agiles often dodge your attacks. Brutes can't be blocked or countered with any weapon except the hidden blade, or alternatively another heavy or long weapon which you can only take away from enemies and can't always carry with you. Brutes also have several strong attacks that can be only dodged, even countering won't work. And finally there's Seekers, who have a spear and their main purpose is to check hiding spots even in an alert state. Which, by the way, is practically uncounterable behavior. You can't distract absolutely anybody in any way from a hiding spot unless the group for hire happens to stand nearby, so if you are undetected but see a Seeker approaching, you will be discovered, another flaw of the stealth system. What's interesting to me is that in loading tips the game itself admits that Seekers make blending useless. Going back, theoretically such a distinction between enemy archetypes should have helped to fix the issues with turtling being the dominant strategy in Assassin's Creed. But here's the thing, all the game ever did is add more reasons to stay defensive. Offensive in Assassin's Creed 1 was discouraged mainly because enemies could counter you at random times that would damage you and there's nothing you could do about it. In Assassin's Creed 2, enemies still can counter you, only without damaging and with a very long animation that breaks the flow of the fight every time it happens. So while there is no active negative effect, it still feels undesirable. Then just on a core gameplay level, the rhythm combo behavior is not as satisfying as it is in Assassin's Creed 1. There is a very weird static pause between the last animation of the combo and the actual finishing animation, which also breaks the flow of the fight. And then when you have an enemy archetype like Agiles who dodge your blows, well, that's another reason to not want to attack. Plus, your defensive capabilities are even better than they were in Assassin's Creed 1. Sure, you can't counter absolutely every archetype with a sword or a knife, but you know what weapon counters everything? The Hidden Blade, which now can block incoming attacks. And its timing window for counters has been increased, so it's far less tricky to do. But if the Hidden Blade timing is still too difficult to achieve for you, there is another defensive move, Counter Disarm, which is what happens when you counter while fighting bare-handed. The window for that is large, you will take away the enemy's weapon, and if you press attack as soon as you do, that's instant death for the guard. There is literally no reason to attack, unless you're in a group fight and can just go behind enemies to instantly slice them that way. And Assassin's Creed 2 has a specific wait less for guards to attack button, Taunt. Use it so you wouldn't have to wait as long for them to go into offensive themselves. Assassin's Creed 2 tries to fix the problem of a dominant strategy by throwing in more things, but without actually fixing the root cause of the issue, only making it deeper really. You've got all this stuff like new weapons, new moves, deeper loadout customization, but all that is a shallow shell that really doesn't matter in any shape or form beyond aesthetics, which are cool indeed. Both old and new animations are great. You can notice a pattern here. Assassin's Creed 2 tends to throw in more mechanics and things at you without actually solving problems, and in some cases making them more numerous. This pattern continues with Parkour. In Assassin's Creed 1, Parkour was a great set of mechanics which sadly had the issue of Altair regularly bugging out or doing something that a player wouldn't expect. Assassin's Creed 2 fixes some issues from the first game, like you're far less likely to stick your head out of a ledge, but most still remain and a bunch of new ones have appeared too. For example, Ezio can now do a backwards leap of faith into a stack of hay or flowers if it's somewhere underneath him when you release a ledge. Now, in this situation, when you press drop down, would you expect to jump down on the roof of the tower that's literally beneath you, or the bale of hay that's dozens of meters below? The game in this situation chooses the second option. There seems to be a really big priority for hay bales in Assassin's Creed 2. For example, if on a tower you try to do a trick of side ejecting to then grab a part of the tower to the side, you will fail because Ezio will prefer to drop down in a leap of faith. Though sometimes the world design luckily prevents Ezio from doing a suddenly prioritized leap of faith.
You should not be up here! There! Don't let them get away!
Assassin's Creed 2 features generally speaking higher buildings than the first game, especially in Venice, which houses the tallest standard buildings in both games. Because of this, Assassin's Creed 2 has added climbing moves that are faster and go farther. The problem is that when doing them, Ezio regularly stops at random points. And it is indeed random. If you climb the same building several times, Ezio will climb it differently. This randomness really affects the navigational gameplay. If you decide to do the same jump in the same direction with overall similar camera position, absolutely every time Ezio will jump to different places. Sometimes when you decide to free-run forward, Ezio, instead of jumping from the ledge you are onto the roof in front of you, jumps somewhere to the side on the streets. Grabbing still remains a move that is mostly used to fix the game's mistakes, but even this one is beyond its power. And don't you dare to free-run past a ladder, Ezio will think that it's best to start climbing it even if you didn't actually want to. It's a pity because when parkour works it feels amazing. But you can't even do advanced mastery moves consistently because at times Ezio will just do whatever. Sometimes it feels that he is even more inconsistent than Altair. Assassin's Creed 2 adds many more interactive elements across all cities. Now you'll be able to climb almost any building from any angle, with the exceptions being mostly some specific landmarks and some common buildings placed there and there around the cities. Outside of the fact that it makes navigational pre-planning less important than in the first game, Ezio clearly can't consistently process all the amount of increased calculations that go his way. This is why parkour actually feels best in the more linear tomb levels, as they're built specifically to keep you in the flow of parkour in a particular way, and there Ezio really can't randomly decide to jump in a different direction than you have expected due to a limited amount of interactive handholds even when there's branching paths. But even there, you might get unlucky and encounter a situation where Ezio doesn't process a particular handhold that he can grab if you try again. So despite having a lot of new features and principles, Assassin's Creed 2 actually fails to address any of the root causes of the gameplay problems the first Assassin's Creed had, rather choosing to distract from them under the guise of options, some of which are just an aesthetic facade more than anything. The reason why it can still engage players is because Assassin's Creed 2 succeeds at many things that surround the core gameplay through variety. You might remember that the first Assassin's Creed had a very distinct core loop: approach, assassinate, escape. That's how assassination missions worked there, and they were the star of the entire experience. The pillars were acting as a support to this loop to define what actions you can take as a player. That loop does not exist in Assassin's Creed 2, and here we come to the second reason why this game is an interesting case study of core pillars. Assassin's Creed 2 doesn't care about the assassination fantasy, it cares about us doing different things: stealth, combat, parkour, and the pillars essentially become the loop. And sometimes the sequence of actions we're doing bears a resemblance to the original approach Assassinate escape loop, but when that happens it's more to add variety. Sure, our very first assassination mission we actually approach target location through stealth, assassinate the target and escape like we would in classic Assassin's Creed. But in the very second assassination mission, we actually start in a place not related directly to the target location to participate in some stealth and combat there, then we're taken to another part of the city to do some combat, then we're sent to the third part of the city so we could do some parkour while going there, and only then do we actually reach the target area, and after killing the target there is actually no escape gameplay, the mission ends. And then in the third assassination mission, after the stealth segment, we go into a chase sequence with no way to assassinate the target without triggering it, even if you try to climb the building for an alternative approach route. You get the idea. Assassin's Creed 2 doesn't want even missions that have assassination targets to have a similar core fantasy, because its goal is to keep engaging us with different gameplay pillars, so it constantly switches between them. The game is not as much about assassinations as it is about a roller coaster of different actions, hence the medieval GTA analogy in the beginning. Assassin's Creed 2 is divided into chapters, called sequences to fit with the overall Animus aesthetic, and if we take a look at the introductory sequence 1, we can apply a predominant pillar to each mission. Now you can see that during our tutorial segment, the predominant pillar is actually parkour, but the game varies it up with combat and stealth. We can go further and actually divide it all by activity subtypes, as not every parkour-focused mission is the same. There are races, deliveries, escape sequences, so even when you participate in a mission focused on the same pillar and mechanics, the context is different. The game regularly unlocks new side missions or features during this introduction, so you keep getting something new. If we move on to sequence 2, you can see that it focuses more on stealth to balance out the small amount of that pillar in the introductory sequence, but again the context of the stealth you're doing keeps changing. Should we take a look at sequences 3 and 4, and you will see that the game really doesn't want you to keep doing similar things in succession, constantly switching up what your goals are. This is exactly why sequence 5 feels like the pacing slows down to a halt. Now, this is one of my favorite sequences in the entire game because it mostly focuses on assassination missions, and that's my preferred gameplay type. But in the context of Assassin's Creed 2 as a whole and what it attempts to do, this is where the pacing suffers, precisely because you're engaging mostly with the same pillar and activity subtype. A similar situation repeats close to the end of the game with Sequence 13, originally released as DLC, but in the PC and Ezio collection versions included as part of the main story. Again, I personally love this sequence because it showcases how Ezio has become a true assassin, not just through the story beat of him getting officially inducted into the Order, but also through gameplay becoming purposefully reminiscent of the first Assassin's Creed that would make each mission focused on mostly stealth infiltrations and assassinations. But even with this in mind, I can't deny that when you reach the spot, it feels like the game transforms into a slog, because Assassin's Creed 2 is best when it varies things up rather than focusing on something in particular. It doesn't help that Venice, which takes up almost half of the whole game, has a lot of missions that repeat in their design. 3 times you'll participate in a mission where you have to free 1 or more allies from cages and escort them. 2 of these missions will come in a row, and 1 features allies that are prone to accidentally killing themselves. Three times you'll have to participate in the act of getting rid of guards, one way or another, in several different locations to complete your goal. Sort of 4 times even, as the mission where you have to assassinate 3 targets in 3 different locations is similar enough in nature, even though the goal is technically different. After you learn the climb leap move in the tutorial mission dedicated to it, you have to complete another mission focused on climb leap that plays practically the same, just this time you have to climb a building rather than a scaffolding. Venice still has enough variety to keep up the overall pace, but it's getting quite clear that with a total of 84 playable main missions across the entire game, Assassin's Creed 2 doesn't have quite enough mission variety going for it to consistently distract from the flaws of the core gameplay mechanics, which become ever so more prominent once you're allowed to actually focus on them. But be sure that Assassin's Creed 2 tries its hardest to do precisely just that. It has a mission where you'll ride in a carriage across the mountain pass, and another one where you fly across Venice on Leonardo's flying machine, which probably is the most memorable set piece of the entire game and one of its definite highs. In case you're tired of doing something in the main missions, the game throws a lot of side quests your way, be it assassination contracts, races, beat-up missions or deliveries. I would call the last two types pretty boring, but they're there. Then there's the unique Tomb and Templar lair missions, and they are some of the best content you'll find in Assassin's Creed 2. Each indeed is unique and provides a memorable experience of its own. In one, you're going through different rooms of Lorenzo de' Medici's house, trying to save him from being assassinated. Another one is a long parkour track across the still partially in construction Il Duomo, where you start at the very bottom but gradually get to the top to receive a seal which helps to unlock the special armor in your villa. It feels like Assassin's Creed 2 is trying to overcompensate for the critical reception of its predecessor. If you're tired of just playing the game, then you can go back to said villa, a home base which acts as the basis for the economy system. Order town renovations so you could get more passive income, which would allow you to buy paintings, weapons, armor or even more renovations. And as you do so, you will gradually see how Monteriggioni becomes more beautiful to look at with more people living in it. This is a very satisfying activity, especially considering that renovating your town adds additional objects to climb on, so you can explore places you couldn't before, which is also rewarding. But the villa does feel somewhat disconnected from the entire experience. Nothing changes if you just ignore it entirely, as if it's there to be one extra loop to vary things up in case you get bored. And even though the game has a means of very effective passive income, it still puts hundreds and hundreds of chests all over the cities for you to loot, and honestly they don't even provide that much money, but they're shiny and emit a catchy sound effect when you're near them, so you're just compelled to go and open them up even if it's a quite useless inclusion.
Remember, it is only divertimento until someone breaks a leg. The Arte del Cambio warns members to avoid the Ventivoglios of Bologna.
It would have been much better if the chest hadn't been there. 100 feathers to collect is more than enough, and this time feathers are connected to the narrative and the villa, so they don't feel quite as useless as flags in Assassin's Creed 1.
I've seen you bringing Maria the feathers. I appreciate what you're trying to do for her, but you have to face facts. It's not working. Maybe you should focus on more important things.
I suppose it is sort of ironic to call Assassin's Creed 2 somewhat bloated, considering that it takes about 20-30 hours to 100% it, less than it takes to complete the main campaign of some newer games, but also bloat is not an absolute, it is relative. There are 30 assassination contracts in this game, and it would have been fine if each of them provided some sort of a nice little experience, but half of them aren't very good. They exist so there will be something else for you to do, something to keep up the variety, even if it is at the cost of the game's overall quality. Assassination contracts that task you to kill 10 brutes within 60 seconds, or dispose of a target that's in an archway guarded from both sides while remaining undetected, provide nice little challenges. But what is the purpose of killing a random person on the street, or getting rid of some archers on the rooftops? It's something you do regularly just on your way to your destination, especially in Venice, the roofs of which are just full of archers, which can get annoying at times, but Assassin's Creed 2 transforms these acts into missions for there to be one additional checkmark for you to complete. And the funny part about this criticism of mine is that you are compelled to check those marks. I have 100%ed this game every time I played it, including when I recorded footage for this review. Which means all chests, all assassination contracts, all the absolutely boring beat-up missions. While it does have parts that feel like a slog, through the way it constantly switches things up, Assassin's Creed 2 taps into your brain to keep you engaged. Sometimes you just can't help but go over to open that shiny chest for a little amount of florins that you don't even need anymore. You bought everything there is to buy, but you still can't resist that chest. There's a pleasure in clearing up a map of activity icons, a sense of progress that feels nice, and Assassin's Creed 2 taps into that deeply, even if not every activity it provides is actually good. But do not take this as a statement that Assassin's Creed 2 lacks merit in its design. We have already discussed a lot of things that it does very well when it comes to missions and gameplay, and when it comes to world design and progression, Assassin's Creed 2 can be considered downright exemplary in many regards. The two big cities, Florence and Venice, are divided into districts. The small cities like Forli and San Gimignano aren't, but they're essentially divided into urban and countryside part, which for the purposes of this analysis we can consider each to be a district. Every district is distinct in how you can navigate it, which affects both the gameplay and visual part. For example, the San Giovanni district in Florence, the one you start in, has traditional classic Italian buildings with slanted tiled roofs. San Marco district in Florence is full of buildings in the middle of construction, so there are a lot of incomplete walls, pillars, as well as things like cranes. And the Santa Maria Novella district has tons of buildings with flat roofs. It may seem like subtle changes, but it affects how you navigate the environment on a fundamental level. Venice has some bigger differences between its districts, like how San Polo is full of these tall houses while the Castello one is not, but it has a lot of stone fences for you to run on, while Cannaregio is full of narrow streets with a lot of parkour objects connecting the buildings above the ground level. All this makes different parts of the city unique to navigate around. Even the countrysides of Tuscany and Romagna feel different. The first one is full of wide fields, while the latter is damp and full of water that your horse would want to avoid. A big part of Assassin's Creed is navigation, and the world of Assassin's Creed 2 makes sure that you never navigate the entirety of it the same way. To be fair, some of that distinction is diluted by the fact that there are so many climbable handholds in comparison to the first Assassin's Creed that you can climb practically every building by just pressing forward, but the world design still leads to varying gameplay parkour opportunities regardless. These districts also play a big part in how Assassin's Creed 2 actually utilizes its world. It is not fully open from the beginning, and practically every sequence you unlock a district in one of the cities, so your playable area only gradually opens up as you keep going. From the design perspective, this leads to a very maximized map usage in these areas. Many open-world games have a problem of space existing but not being used for anything beyond some little things like collectibles. Assassin's Creed 2 is not one of them, as when a new area opens up, what designers want is for players to play in that area, which means that it will get filled with missions, both main and side. If we take a look at Florence, this is the area that is available to us in the beginning, and these are the areas used in the main and side missions available at the time, with the red parts being mandatory for completion locations you have to visit, and the blue parts being a probability space, places you will likely pass by as you go from one objective to another. Thanks to how packed it is, you will get to learn the district you're in pretty well while you run around and complete your tasks. This is how the mission realization space looks once you unlock San Marco in Sequence 2, this is how it looks when you unlock Santa Maria Novella in Sequence 4, and when you get back to Florence in Sequence 13. Practically everything is utilized for the purposes of missions, with the exceptions being the edges of the city and the southern area, which was available only with the story DLC, so no side missions were put there. Now let's take a look at Venice. It has a similar situation. From Sequence 7 to Sequence 11, you will keep opening up new districts in this city, and practically none of it is left unutilized for missions. Of course, as we have mentioned before, the quality of the missions themselves is not always consistent, but the point here is that even though the city is quite big, Assassin's Creed 2 wants to make sure that no stone is left unturned. Even in cities with countryside space, Assassin's Creed 2 attempts to maximize the open world utilization in missions, like you can see in the example of San Gimignano here, or the other small city in the game, Forli, here. Both of these world design aspects play into what's at the core of Assassin's Creed 2, variety. Because putting a mission into a location that wasn't used means you'll get to visit a place you haven't yet, which means a little bit of something new, and you will get to that location in a way that's not quite the same as before, because this area is designed to be parkoured around differently than the other one. Assassin's Creed 2 doesn't want to be a game about assassinations. It wants to be an adventure where you have a lot of things to do, and each one is not the same as the last, where the aspect of assassinations is only but one of the flavors, not the actual heart. This is why Assassin's Creed 2 has been a success despite not really fixing the flaws of the first title. The game distracts you from them by throwing as much varied content as possible, and most of the time it succeeds at that rather well. For every uninteresting mission about killing random targets in several locations, there is an elaborate escort mission across the water canals of Venice, where you have to use appropriate parkour routes to reach and dispose of archers, and it feels great. For every mission that's about walking around to carry a box, there's a nice assassination setup where you have to use the crowds to get to the target undetected. For every absolutely boring tailing across Italian streets where you literally don't have to do anything except walk, there's elaborate and engaging tailing where you can use multiple parkour routes or hired groups to make sure you won't lose sight of your target as they pass by guarded areas. And of course, for every mission that's about killing a random dude in the middle of the street, there is a fantastic flight above Venice as you try to reach a location that for all intents and purposes can't be infiltrated, but you found a way. This is why, should you open up all the scores for design, feel free to pause if you'd like to read them all, I will assign a 7 to Assassin's Creed 2. From the perspective of game design, it is pretty messy. All aspects of core gameplay are inconsistent in their implementation, at times quite broken, new features cancel other design choices out. It is clearly a game that is reactive in its approach to design. It doesn't have in mind a particular experience that it would like to build, rather it's a game that just wants to avoid criticisms the predecessor has encountered, and seems to go by the principle of the more things you add, the more chances there are that it will work out. And yet Assassin's Creed 2 also has a lot of things going for it. The world structure and how you progress through it is great, there are many fun missions and memorable moments, renovating your villa is simple mechanically and is not integrated holistically into the rest of the game's design, but leads to emotional attachment to the town nonetheless. The way the game gradually opens up is engaging, and despite its flaws, Assassin's Creed 2 makes completing it compelling thanks to how it handles providing varied content to us. Now let's talk about context. This category has a weight of 1, as it's about things that usually enhance the experience rather than define it. Plot, characters, motivation, etc. If you haven't played the game and want to avoid the biggest plot spoilers, then consider this to be the spoiler warning and skip to the aesthetics chapter if you want to avoid those. This part is another aspect where Assassin's Creed 2 differs greatly in style from the first game. The original Assassin's Creed focused on philosophies, politics, religion, the examination of the state of mankind, with the lens of conspiracy theory being something that would add spice to all that and also help with some of the more controversial notions to fly under the radar. Assassin's Creed 2 isn't any of that, really. Like with many of its design choices, it feels as if the game tried to distance itself as much as possible from Assassin's Creed 1. Gone is the depiction of history that tries to avoid overused tropes and stereotypes, painting a picture of the past that, while fantastic in many regards thanks to the sci-fi elements, is also grounded in reality. Assassin's Creed 2 barrages you with easily recognizable tropes and stereotypes instead. Fistfights between two groups of hot-headed teenagers, the main character is an Italian ladies' man, father fakes anger because our actions remind him of his youth actually, beating up unfaithful boyfriends, all up to the point of having pop culture references.
It's a me, Mario!
Complex villain motivation that doesn't excuse their horrible actions but helps to understand them better? Nothing of that here. Bad guys are power-hungry villains with no redeeming points beyond some little tidbits you might find in an optional letter or slideshow video about the target. The death confessions, being the pivotal moment of understanding our target before its death, transform into just a cool short thing that happens, to the point that their concept itself is ridiculed.
I'm sorry. Were you hoping for a confession?
Modern Day being about a subversion of modern myths, turning the date of December 21st, 2012 into a day when the Templars launched their satellite to gain control over the human race, won't hear a thing about that. The map that we found at the end of last game is made irrelevant, offhandedly mentioned in an optional conversation. What is actually important is a vault that we suddenly need because it turns out a member of the previously alive civilization sends a warning that December 23rd, 2012 an actual solar flare will destroy everything alive on Earth, and the only person who can stop it? Well, us, of course.
The rest is up to you, Desmond.
What? Who is Desmond? I don't understand. Please wait. I have so many questions.
What the fuck?
And that whole twist is done while minimizing the time you spend in Modern Day as much as possible. Only 3 short sections, about 30 minutes in total length unless you decide to participate in optional conversations, only so would spend as little time as possible with Desmond in order to avoid any sort of criticisms the first game had. And if you want to find some modern day lore, instead of emails you actually have a very clever mechanism in the form of puzzles hidden within the Animus's recreated historical world that reveal different lore tidbits. But even here the nature of this information wildly differs in style. There is no more restraint in how the ancient conspiracy war between assassins and Templars has influenced history. Practically every important historical event is connected to this conflict now, to the point that World War II was actually orchestrated by Templars themselves, which literally robs this group of the last possible redeeming points it could have had, transforming them into ultimate evil. The only part reminiscent of previous Assassin's Creed complexity is the codex written by Altair himself, where he ponders on the ironies of the assassin order, complexities of life, consequences of our actions. But this last remaining part of the first Assassin's Creed is appropriately enough torn into pages scattered across the land that we have to collect one by one, and even when we find all that are available in the game, it is clear that we won't ever make the codex actually whole again. None of this is what makes Assassin's Creed 2 a worse story, but one is undeniably clear: it's not only different, it wants to be different and as unrelated as possible to the first game. And in that sense, it sort of is a game that wants to have its cake and eat it too, like with the modern day situation where Assassin's Creed 2 minimizes the time spent in modern day as much as possible, while increasing its importance and by extension the importance of us and Desmond to literally cosmic levels. Assassin's Creed 2 gameplay ends with a fistfight against a non-believer pope in the depths of the Vatican, unsuccessfully trying to combine at least some semblance of commentary on religion and power with a cool and fun, if somewhat ridiculous, moment. And look, the problem is not in the premise of the story. A teenager living a carefree life, going on a quest of revenge for the death of his family before realizing that there is a higher purpose at stake which he then becomes a part of? It can work out in so many different ways, but Assassin's Creed 2 always goes for the most standard, recognizable approaches to make sure it will be palatable for an incredibly massive audience. And for what it's worth, even with that direction it has many great moments. For example, the game title sequence still gives me chills every time I see it.
It is a good life we lead, brother.
The best. May it never change.
And may it never change us.
Then there's a pivotal speech at the end of the game that showcases just how much Ezio has changed over the 2 decades of his journey. It is somewhat cheesy and in a way provides only a very basic outlook on the philosophy it taps into, but it still represents an important message and makes it feel more like, well, Assassin's Creed.
Vengeance clouded my mind. Would have consumed me, were it not for the wisdom of a few strangers. Taught me to look past my instincts. It never preached answers, but guided me to learn from myself. We don't need anyone to tell us what to do. Not Savonarola, not the Medici. We are free to follow our own path. There are those who will take that freedom from us. Too many of you gladly give it. But it is our ability to choose whatever you think is true that makes us human. There is no book or teacher to give you the answers, show you the path. Choose your own way. Do not follow me or anyone else.
Here's the thing though, Assassin's Creed 2 has a bunch of moments that are actually good on their own, but they sort of fail to connect properly. Ezio's arc doesn't really make sense. He starts off as a pretty arrogant and carefree teenager who after betrayal against his family goes on a quest of revenge while discovering that his father and ancestors were assassins. Good enough, right? Ezio, thanks to teachers like his Uncle Mario, gradually learns how to respect the dead.
Vorrei solo che avessi sofferto di più! Hai avuto la fine che meritavi! Spero che
Enough, Ezio! Show some respect.
Respect? After all that's happened, do you think he would have shown either of us such kindness?
You are not Fieri. Do not become him. Che la morte ti dia le pace che cercavi. Requiesca in pace.
And then revenge starts taking a backseat. He literally says to one of his targets that he is not killing them for himself.
It takes one assassin to kill another, it seems.
We kill thinking it's best for us. Do we not, Messer Ezio?
I do this not for myself. Compio questo sacrificio per il bene superiore. Requiescat in pace.
This progression culminates in the speech I have shown earlier, acceptance of the Assassin's Creed. So Ezio no longer wants to reach personal catharsis by enacting revenge on the mastermind behind the death of his family, the Templar leader Rodrigo Borgia, and is ready to do what is needed for the greater good, right? Well...
I thought I was beyond this. But I'm not. I've waited too long, lost too much. Requiescat in pace, you bastard!
Okay, well, even if Ezio is not over revenge, killing Rodrigo is still going to work out for the greater good, so his personal desires and assassin duties coincide and we're fine, right? Well...
Get it over with, then.
No. Killing you won't bring my family back. I'm done. Nulla è reale. Tutto è lecito. Requiescat in pace.
After the whole game being somewhat haphazardly about Ezio overcoming his personal desires and accepting the assassin duties, he neglects the assassin duties to satisfy his personal catharsis by letting revenge go, which he seemingly has let go already but actually didn't. You can see how it sort of doesn't really flow there. And it's not the only narrative part of Assassin's Creed 2 that doesn't, but we can sort of divide the game into halves, before we reach Venice and after. In other words, sequences 1 to 6 and sequences 7 to 14. Sequences 1 to 6 are very well thought out. There are some hiccups, like Ezio can feel quite dense when he states that his father was just a banker, after taking and putting on weird clothes from his father's chest alongside an ancient weapon designed to silently kill people.
But what about your father? He'd want you to finish his work.
What work? My father was a banker.
Come on, Ezio, you can't possibly believe that Giovanni was just a banker. And there are some weird forced situations, like Ezio getting to the crowd in an attempt to ambush some conspirators, but not actually doing anything until those conspirators kill a bunch of people. Or Caterina Sforza just standing in the middle of a little island for some reason in need of help. What was she doing there? Why? How did she get there? Who knows? But as a whole, it still flows very well. Sequence 1 successfully introduces who Ezio is, makes sure that we spend a little bit of time with each member of his family while life is still normal, alongside making acquaintance with Leonardo da Vinci, who will become Ezio's lifelong friend. It also introduces the Pazzi family through Ezio's antithesis, Vieri. And then Sequence 1 ends with a big betrayal and Ezio becoming a criminal.
I'll kill you for what you've done! Guards! Arrest him!
Sequence 2 would be about learning the basic assassin skills to exact his revenge on the man who condemned his family to death, and Sequence 3 would be about discovering the larger fight between assassins and Templars, and in sequences 4 and 5, Ezio deals with the Pazzi conspiracy against Florence. At the end of Sequence 5, Ezio has the first direct encounter with the mastermind behind all the Templar plans, Rodrigo Borgia, and it's far from a successful one, which is a good tease for further interactions.
Did you honestly think I wouldn't expect you to follow? That I didn't plan for it? We've been at this a lot longer than you. Kill him.
And in this sequence, Ezio learns that there are more Templars in Venice, to which he travels together with his friend Leonardo, who all this time would have had built different tools based on Altair's Codex pages that Ezio finds. The first half of the story has everything a good narrative needs to have: proper setups, progression, intrigue, resolution. But then we get to Venice, and it's just a mess. Characters just come and go. In Sequence 7 you meet the thief Ugo and build up a trusting relationship with him, which is going to be irrelevant, since starting with Sequence 8 we won't hear about him ever again. This sequence is also where we meet Rosa, a potential romantic partner of Ezio judging by their interactions, but we wouldn't know since after Sequence 7 she's present only in a few cutscenes and then we never hear about her again in this game. In Sequence 11 we suddenly meet Niccolò Machiavelli, who is a very important figure in the Assassin Order. He is younger than Ezio and yet was inducted earlier without Ezio hearing anything about it, and probably it wasn't hidden from Niccolò like it was from Ezio that absolutely all allies except Leonardo are assassins. This plot twist is weird and pointless enough, but what is stranger is the fact that Leonardo seems to know almost every assassin ally we meet during our adventures before we do, and he's not even an assassin. Then years just pass by without any rhyme or reason to somehow keep up with the historical events Assassin's Creed 2 wants to put you in. Sequences 1 to 6 took place from 1476 to 1480, 4 years. Sequences 7 to 14 take place from 1481 to the end of 1499, 18 years. And the time jumps don't make sense. So Sequence 7 starts in 1481, when we go to assassinate our target, their Templar ally tells them that the assassin has been in Venice for weeks, and in several days they have a meeting. Sequence 8 starts in 1485 at the day of that meeting, with a contradicting 5-year time jump. Then the next couple of Venice sequences take place in 1486, after that we have a 2-year time jump to 1488 for 2 sequences, followed by another time jump of 9 years towards 1497. Now, there is a side game called Assassin's Creed 2 Discovery that sort of tries to fill part of that big gap, but it is still not clear at all what Ezio has been doing all these years exactly. It's just the game can't let him complete his goals before an appropriate historical event appears on the horizon. And then there's the actual story of the Venice sequences, 7 to 11. Not only does it put the progression of the narrative to a grinding halt, with more and more targets just appearing out of nowhere without any emotional connection to Ezio like the Pazzi had to drive the player's motivation, this part of the game just doesn't make sense. It starts with a bunch of little problems, strange questions like why do we need to steal guard armor if after that we have to kill a bunch of guards anyway whose gloves will be there for the taking, or how Ezio is purposefully made stupid for a moment that after a whole mission of successfully tailing all the Templars, including his arch-nemesis, he suddenly loses sight of them in a cutscene.
Bene, I must return to Roma. Time is of the essence. Do not fail us.
Idiota sono. I should have kept my eyes on them. I need to go and see Antonio if I have any hope of salvaging this mess I've made.
But all that doesn't compare to the absolute nonsense that is Sequence 9, the Carnivale. And look, I will ignore the fact that Teodora is a nun who runs a brothel with a justification that sounds like an attempt of a horny teenage boy to sound progressive.
How I choose to practice my faith, what I choose to do with my body. These are my choices to make. Like many young women, I was drawn to the church, but grew disillusioned by the believers of the city. Men hold God only as an idea in their heads, not in the depths of their hearts and bodies. Men must know how to love in order to reach salvation. My girls and I provide that to our congregation. No church would agree with me, I realized, so I created my own. It may not be traditional, but men's hearts grow firmer in my care.
Among other things, I'm sure.
Also, talking about how what women do with their bodies is their choice while rewarding Ezio's successful mission by sending 3 courtesans to sleep with Ezio is tone-deaf to say the least. So we won't focus on that nonsensical aspect, but rather talk about the plot of this sequence. The premise is that our next target, Marco Barbarigo, doesn't live the impenetrable Palazzo Ducale, so we have to somehow lure him out. Except that this place is not impenetrable, we have successfully infiltrated it with a flying machine just a mission ago, but alright. Now is the time of the Carnivale, and Marco as the new Doge can't stay in the Palazzo and will hold a private party, attendance of which is possible only with special golden masks, every one of which is numbered so we can't steal one. But we can win one at the Carnivale games. If Marco has to leave the palace, there are so many ways we could kill him on the way to the party, but let's swallow this for the sake of having a cool setting to murder somebody in, fine. We go through all the games, one of which is a super annoying capture the flag that you literally can't complete without jumping from insane heights, otherwise you just won't be fast enough, and at the end of it all, the Templars bribe the Carnivale host, and the mask is awarded to the Templar henchman Dante Moro. So what do we do now? Well, he's one of our targets anyway, so might as well kill him on the way to the party and take the mask? No, they will cancel the party in this case, even though it's unclear how the news about a silent death would spread that fast, so we have to do what we couldn't in the first place, steal the mask. After we steal it and go to the party, well, several things happen. First, we are the only ones wearing the golden masks here, all other NPCs wear standard ones. Second, our ally, Sister Teodora and her courtesans, are in the party, and without any masks. So you want to say that they had access to it all along? And third, everything is ruined by the arrival of the person we were explicitly told to not kill, who also entered without a mask, and makes our lives harder by forcing us to hide from guards for some time. Also, Marco could stand on a boat, which means the infiltration of the party wasn't mandatory at all. The game really wants you to use the hidden gun, but if you want you can swim to the boat instead. And Venice doesn't stop being nonsensical after. Sequence 10 is about luring out the remaining Templars out of the L'Arsenale by starting riots across the district, only to discover that the Templars were actually leaving for Cyprus to find Altair's Apple of Eden there, and taking the Doge's seat was just a distraction, they didn't care for it. So the Templars literally had no reason to take the bait placed for them, they were leaving, but they still took it anyway. And then in Sequence 11 the Templars are back with the apple and want to give it to Rodrigo Borgia. Ezio has the best plan to impersonate a guard who would be the one to deliver the apple, only to reveal himself at the stupidest possible moment, prompting Rodrigo to run away. Then the story moves away from Venice and starts making more sense, but in turn becomes mostly about Apple switching hands back and forth, and this just drags a bunch. Although Sequence 13 does feel a bit more like Assassin's Creed 1 by trying to examine the question of what power does to people, and I do appreciate it for that. Ironically, the bunch of nameless targets in this part of the story that we meet just once have more depth to them than all the Templars that we have killed beforehand. Though Ezio can't seem to decide what is his opinion regarding the question of willpower and being forced or letting someone to control you, as he gives inconsistent responses to each target.
What have I done? What have I done?
Your actions were not your own.
He charmed me with that thing.
Only because you allowed it.
Is this truly who I was? So proud and cruel.
No. Savonarola bewitched you.
And then there's Modern Day, which barely progresses any plot point beyond setting up the "we gotta save the world" scenario. It does introduce Sean and Rebecca in addition to Lucy as allied assassins, and those two new characters are quite likable despite being also very tropey, as is everything else in Assassin's Creed 2. And also the game sets up a very intriguing danger for Desmond. The bleeding effect, which is what the team uses to teach Desmond assassin skills by transposing memories of his ancestor onto Desmond himself. While useful, this same bleeding effect can make Desmond go crazy by starting to confuse realities, just like it happened with Subject 16, an Abstergo captive before Desmond. And it already has started with Desmond being able to watch Altair's memories without an animus. Intriguing narrative obstacle. Will the series do anything with it? We shall see. Let's open up all the scores for context. I will assign a 7. The narrative of Assassin's Creed 2 drastically changes the tone and direction of the first Assassin's Creed story, with only bits and pieces of that old style left there and there, though that alone does not influence the scoring. What does is the fact that it's incredibly inconsistent. Everything from the beginning of the game to its middle point is actually very well structured, but then it becomes a big mess with some parts still enjoyable and memorable enough that it reaches this score. Time to discuss aesthetics. This category also has a weight of 1, as it's again about things that enhance the experience rather than define it. Visual style, music, sounds, etc. Now, you know that we're taking a look at the Ezio Collection version here, and at the beginning of the video I have mentioned not only the improvements, but also some visual flaws that this version of the game has. I will say that by and large these flaws don't affect the scoring, as everything I will talk about here concerns all versions. Assassin's Creed 2 changes its direction in this category as well, though this time it is more than justified with the Renaissance setting. If Assassin's Creed 1 felt very gritty and lived in, then this game, quite in contrast, feels very clean and colorful. No longer do clothes have all the little flaws that make them look worn, they're very nice and pristine, even when it concerns some thieves' rags. The environments are bright and colorful, the animus itself is white with a lot of abstract clarity as opposed to the fogginess of the animus from Assassin's Creed 1. If you look at it only from a stylistic perspective, it works. But aesthetically, Assassin's Creed 2 is full of flaws, both creative and technical in nature. The facial animation in this game is really not great, even for its time, with a lot of faces looking very weird. Sound design is absolutely lacking. It is not uncommon for cutscenes to not have sound effects for things that are happening right in the center of the screen.
Make yourselves useful! Clear a space for her! Put her down there!
But the big one is the music, and not the tracks themselves because they are absolutely amazing, but how they are used in the game. Unlike Assassin's Creed 1, the music of which was fully focused on the aspect of location and what action we're doing in this location, the sequel tries to start using leitmotifs, mainly through Ezio's family theme, which by this point is an incredibly known musical piece. The thing is, the game is very bad at it. In cutscenes we hear Ezio's theme literally 2 times, once in the title screen scene,
Best. May it never change.
and may it never change us.
And another time when Ezio gets his robes in the variation from the track called Earth.
Bring this to Messer Roberto.
There are so many pivotal moments in Ezio's life: the death of his family, joining the assassins, the speech at the bonfire. Do we hear Ezio's theme during any of these? No! In fact, what we usually hear is a variation of the theme representing Venice. Here is the Tour of Venice track used as ambience for the city. And here is its variation that plays during the moment when Ezio contemplates his entire life. The most character-defining moment in the game, and the theme representing that character is not used. And this track I just played, people don't really associate it with Venice anymore because of where it was played. That's the power of leitmotifs and why Assassin's Creed 2 doesn't use them properly. To be fair, in gameplay we will hear Ezio's theme more than once. First, it is the basis of the music for all races, Venice Rooftops. And it's also subtly woven into some ambient music tracks. But it's not music put in with a real sense of importance. It's saying something when you hear only around 50 seconds of the two most popular songs on the soundtrack. In general, despite choosing to have more specifically directed cutscenes with particular usage of camera positions and cuts, as opposed to the first game when in a lot of situations you could move around and control the camera yourself, Assassin's Creed 2 almost never uses music in a way that would purposefully coincide with what's happening on screen. It's usually some ambience or the track that has been currently playing in gameplay. And even in gameplay, the music is not always used with dramatic efficiency. Remember how in Assassin's Creed 1 video I've shown the feeling of hell breaking loose after we commence our assassination? Well, here is the same situation in Assassin's Creed 2. Yeah. Now, in this particular case, the lack of appropriate music is caused by full notoriety, which is forced upon you in this first assassination. And full notoriety has a specific track for it that overrides all other tracks regardless of gameplay situations. Not the best choice. But also, even when that's not the case, when you're running away it takes too long for the chase music to kick in, and due to the chase radius being very short, you won't hear much of it anyway. Showcasing action is generally speaking not Assassin's Creed 2's strongest suit. The game feels best atmospherically when it focuses on peaceful ambience. Like for example going around Monteregione with a sort of homely but at the same time mysterious sounding music in the background. Or when it embraces the romantic side of Venice. But very often Assassin's Creed 2 tries to showcase either large riots or battles, and that just doesn't work. Sometimes not all civilians are removed from the scenes in these cases, and even when all walking and standing NPCs are removed, you still have town criers and doctors and people sitting around on benches, and all that just doesn't gel well with the turmoil happening supposedly all over the city. And many of such missions turn up your notoriety to the max, which means no action music. Yeah, if we open up all the possible scores for aesthetics, I will assign a 7 to Assassin's Creed 2. The overall direction is very solid, and when everything falls into pieces, the game feels amazing. But far too often there are different problems, some of them are bugs, some are oversights, some are just strange creative choices that I'm sure had the reasons behind them but did not work out well in the end, and there's far too many of them. Let's talk about Cohesion. This category has a weight of 2 and it's about how well the game connects everything into a wholesome, cohesive experience. I suppose by this point, after you've heard and seen everything I have talked about, it's quite clear that Assassin's Creed 2 doesn't revolve around any particular fantasy or core. And while that is certainly a shame, it doesn't mean that the game lacks cohesion, as there are a lot of elements built in with the purpose of the world and the experience feeling more wholesome. For example, remember how I've mentioned that the Animus UI in Assassin's Creed 2 is more white and clinically clean? Well, that's the Animus 2.0 version developed by Assassins, and yet at the very beginning Desmond enters for a brief moment into Abstergo's Animus 1.28 used in the previous game, and its interface elements are quite foggy, just like in that game. And connecting to Ezio's memories for the first time is accompanied by images from the game, just like it happened when connecting to Altair's memories in the previous title, and this kind of stuff doesn't happen in the Animus modified by Rebecca. Ezio learns most of his skills gradually, and while there are some mistakes like the counterattack still being available before it is officially taught to your character, it is still pretty neat how mechanical progression is tied to both the character and story progression as well as Altair's codex, thanks to which Ezio not only has Leonardo build various new tools, but also learns new assassination techniques unavailable to you when first getting the Hidden Blade. Side missions appear either when you've done a similar activity or when it makes sense story-wise. For example, assassination contracts in the context of the story are sent to you by Lorenzo de' Medici, so they're unlocked only after you save him from the Pazzi conspiracy. And though the justification for beat-up and delivery missions is quite weak, the point is that the game doesn't try to introduce these activities simply out of nowhere. I've mentioned Leonardo before, and this is a character who really feels like a lifelong friend, even though out of 84 main missions, 88 if you count missions that are purely cutscenes, we see him only in 13. That's the same amount of main mission interactions we have with Antonio the Thief, and that guy for sure doesn't feel like a best friend, doesn't he? Well, that is the fact that Leonardo builds your tool arsenal throughout the story, so you have a constant gameplay reminder of what he has done for you, but also whenever you find one or more codex pages, you can go to him so he would decode them for you, and decoding 4 codex pages increases your health.
Leonardo!
Ezio, so good to see you. How can I help you?
Haha! You found another one! How exciting!
I just have to substitute this letter and move this over there. I've got it.
So even though Leonardo doesn't appear too often in the 20-hour journey that is Assassin's Creed 2, the game keeps reminding us about him through gameplay means, and that's why he feels like a true friend. A similar technique is used with the Monteriggioni Villa passive income. You have to eventually get back to your town to take it, otherwise the bank limit will be full and you won't be able to gain money. And when you get back to take money, naturally you start participating in spending it to upgrade the city, purchase some new weapons, and all those things increase Monteriggioni's value, which in turn changes the town's appearance. So if in the beginning you would see that it's a very run-down town with barely anybody living in it, by the middle of the game it becomes very lively and homely, so you get emotionally attached to it, even though everything the game does is just nudge you to visit it from time to time to do some quick little purchases. So even with the lack of a central experience, the aforementioned Modiregioni, for example, really doesn't fit anywhere, it's just there even if it does have narrative justification, Assassin's Creed 2 does a lot of things that successfully create emotional responses based on interactions. Which, if you know my system, would have led to me assigning a score of 10 in this category, if not for all the things that transform Assassin's Creed 2 into quite a mess, which is why I will assign an 8. You know, all the things we have talked about before, so I'm not going to repeat them in detail, like the nonsensical Carnivale sequence with arbitrary mission fail goals, how detection is often forced upon you ignoring your gameplay style just to make sure there's some variety, how aesthetics far from always represent the atmosphere the game is aiming for. Assassin's Creed 2 has a strong cohesion aspect, but not exemplary. Time for our final category, emotions. This is the most subjective category of Stasocritic, as it is all about personal feelings when playing a game, but it also has the second biggest weight, 3, because personal feelings define our enjoyment a lot. Even when an experience is flawed, it can still be a delight to play. When Assassin's Creed 2 was released, more specifically on PC back in 2010, as that's when I played it for the first time, I was actually quite disappointed. You know my love for the first game and how important it was to me, and I've anticipated the sequel so much, and in a way it was depressing that it wasn't anything like its predecessor. I was one of those who kept saying that Assassin's Creed 2 is not an improvement over the first game in every way, and I was seen as a weirdo for doing that. But you know, nothing is true, everything is permitted, so I didn't let that fact become a sore point for me and just stuck with what was true for me, rather than trying to change somebody's mind. And then, after game design has transformed from a hobby into a profession, I was able to start putting into words everything that bothered me in Assassin's Creed 2 from the gameplay perspective. It's unrefined, janky, inconsistent. You heard me talk about a lot of the problems in the design section already. I was sad that Assassin's Creed 2 looked objectively worse and less atmospheric than the first game, and what happened to the story to me was a crime, really. I probably was one of the few people for whom Desmond's what the fuck at the end of the game wasn't an exciting what the fuck, but an actual what the fuck. Because what I was expecting was the continuation of the smart twist on the end of the world that the first game had set up. What we've got was literally the opposite of that. And then at the time Assassin's Creed was said to be a trilogy, and I always wondered how the hell would Ubisoft be able to resolve this within a single sequel. Don't worry, fans on the forums would say they have a plan. I was one of the few arguing that they don't, because you don't do sudden changes like this if you have a plan. And now, after actually working at Ubisoft, I know that in this regard I was pretty much right. While there was technically a plan for Assassin's Creed, the plan itself changed regularly. What it was during the production of the first and second game was not the same thing, changing even mid-production, so it might as well have not been there. With such a big amount of criticisms against the game, you might wonder, how did it become so popular? Why even now it resonates with people so much? You know, I can be cynical and double down on the notions I've talked about in the design and context sections of Assassin's Creed 2 playing with our brains by providing varied objectives and the story going for the lowest common denominator for extreme levels of palatability, so as few things as possible would feel out of place. And look, those aspects are certainly part of the equation. But here's the thing, they're also certainly not everything there is to it. I have played Assassin's Creed 2 multiple times myself, and I have 100%ed it every time I've played it. Not just because of the design tricks, even though I'm fully aware that they worked on me, but because it just feels nice to be there. Some sort of magic, one can say. Even with all the problems I have had with Assassin's Creed 2 back in 2010, I felt that magic back then, and even when replaying it now more than a decade later, I still feel it. Assassin's Creed 2 is a game where each one of its aspects is not very strong on its own, but when taken together they manage to create something far greater. The title screen, Leonardo's sadistic joke about cutting your finger, getting the hidden blade, your first skill, exploring Florence, Venice and other Italian cities, All that and more, it feels good. Great, even. This is why Assassin's Creed 2 stands at 90+ on Metacritic, why so many people say that it's their favorite Assassin's Creed game, even many fans for whom this wasn't the first or even second or even third game in the series that they have played. Because something just clicks. And for the life of me, I wouldn't be able to explain to you what exactly, even with all the years of experience under my belt. By all accounts, Assassin's Creed 2 is a game that simply shouldn't work. It veered off into the opposite direction in comparison to its predecessor, its gameplay is janky, a big chunk of its missions and activities is of average quality at most, story is messy, Ezio doesn't make sense, aesthetically it is very unpolished, but for some reason, it still works. Magic. If I open up all the scores for emotions, I will assign a 10. Assassin's Creed 2 is a game that I have discussed with fans for more than a decade. It's a game that I have so many problems with, a game that literally has transformed Assassin's Creed as a brand into something I wouldn't want it to be. A great disappointment. And yet I just can't stop playing it whenever I start, and I have so many wonderful memories of it. Sounds contradictory? Probably, but it is what it is. Let's conclude our very long video now. After all scores and weights are taken into account, Assassin's Creed 2 gets a final Stasocritic rating of 78. It's a really good game. I wouldn't say that it's nearly as good as many people say it is, but it's a matter of emotions trampling over analysis. It is difficult not to enjoy this title. There's something ethereal about Assassin's Creed 2 that I just can't place my finger on. Possibly no one can. Would I recommend playing it? Definitely. But it's not Assassin's Creed anymore. The modern Hitman titles are truer sequels to the first Assassin's Creed than this game. There are many people who lament how Assassin's Creed has changed direction as a franchise, but it's not the first time it has happened. The first big shift was as early as the first sequel to the original game. And I can't help but feel some sort of sadness inside that instead of focusing on the direction that the first Assassin's Creed has set up, the developers decided to turn away from that as far as possible for the sequel. And don't get me wrong, I am happy for everyone who has become a fan of the series thanks to this title, and there will be more good games that follow this direction, some of which will try to bring back elements of the original Assassin's Creed in some shape or form, both in terms of gameplay and narrative. Assassin's Creed 2 is a good game, but as a game designer, I can't help but wonder what would happen if the series had decided to double down on what made it unique and experimental rather than start following mainstream trends. Alas, since this is history already, we will never know.